It was a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, and the sky was wrong. Not overcast, not stormy. This was something else entirely. The sun, which had been burning over the Judean hills all morning, simply stopped giving its light. At noon, in the middle of the day, over one of the most populated cities in the Roman Empire, during the most attended Jewish festival of the year. For 3 hours, darkness covered the land, and hanging on a Roman cross on a hill called Golgotha, a man who had claimed to be the Son of God was dying. Now, every gospel writer recorded this darkness: Matthew, Mark, Luke. All three of them describe it in nearly identical language. From the 6th hour to the 9th hour, darkness fell over the whole land. That's not a throwaway detail. That's not a metaphor buried in poetry. That's a specific time-stamped claim about an observable natural phenomenon made by multiple independent writers, about an event that would have been witnessed by tens of thousands of people gathered in Jerusalem for Passover. But they weren't the only ones who wrote about it. Roman historians recorded it too. Greek chroniclers mentioned it. A century later, an early church father literally told Roman officials to go check their own government archives if they didn't believe him. So what actually happened during those 3 hours? Was this a solar eclipse, like some skeptics have claimed? A volcanic event? Mass hysteria? Or was it something that science genuinely cannot explain? That question has been debated for nearly 2,000 years. And the answer takes us from ancient Jerusalem to modern geology labs, from Hebrew prophecies written 700 years before the event, to sediment cores pulled from the bottom of the Dead Sea. This is the story of the 3 hours that changed history. Jerusalem, approximately 33 AD. The city was bursting. Passover brought somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 Jewish pilgrims flooding through the gates every year. Based on estimates from the Jewish historian Josephus, they came from Galilee, from the coastal plains, from the eastern deserts, from as far away as Rome and Alexandria. The population of the city swelled to 4 or 5 times its normal size. And all of them were there for one reason: to remember the night God freed their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. The night when, according to the book of Exodus, the angel of death passed over the homes marked with lamb's blood. The logistics of Passover were staggering. Every family needed a lamb. Not just any lamb. An unblemished male lamb, 1 year old, selected on the 10th of Nisan and kept for 4 days before being slaughtered on the 14th. Josephus records that during one Passover, the priests counted approximately 256,000 lambs sacrificed. 256,000 in a single afternoon. The entire city smelled of roasting meat and burning incense from the temple, where priests worked in shifts from noon until evening to handle the sheer volume of sacrifices. Blood ran through channels carved into the stone floor of the temple courts, draining out through pipes into the Kidron Valley below. This is the world Jesus entered earlier that week. And if you'd been standing on the Mount of Olives on Sunday, looking west over Jerusalem, you would have seen something remarkable. Crowds lining the road from Bethany down the hillside and up to the eastern gate, palm branches covering the path, people shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David," which was an explicitly messianic title. They weren't being subtle about what they meant. They thought he was about to overthrow Rome. They thought the long-awaited Messiah was finally going to claim his throne, rally the nation, and establish the kingdom the prophets had promised. The kingdom where Israel would be free and God's anointed would rule from Jerusalem. 5 days later, many of those same voices were screaming for his execution. The speed of that reversal still catches historians off guard. 1 week. From triumphal entry to death sentence. From king to criminal. And the religious and political machinery that made it happen moved with a speed that tells you something important. The people in power were afraid of him, not annoyed, not inconvenienced, afraid. The high priest Caiaphas had been working behind the scenes for months. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council of 71 elders, had already decided that Jesus needed to die. The Gospel of John records a remarkably candid statement from Caiaphas. He told the council that it was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. That's a political calculation dressed up as prophecy. Caiaphas was worried that the Jesus movement would provoke Rome into a military crackdown. The irony is that this is exactly what happened about 40 years later, in 70 AD, when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, breached the walls, and burned the temple to the ground. The very disaster Caiaphas was trying to prevent came anyway, and the man he killed to prevent it wasn't the cause. So they arrested Jesus at night in the Garden of Gethsemane, using one of his own followers to identify him. Judas Iscariot, 30 pieces of silver. It was the price of a slave in the book of Exodus. You could buy a field with it. You could also buy a betrayal. What most people don't realize is how illegal the trial was. Under Jewish law, capital cases could not be tried at night. They could not be tried during a festival. They required at least 2 witnesses whose testimony agreed. The accused had the right to a defense, and a guilty verdict could not be handed down on the same day as the trial to allow time for the judges to reconsider. The proceedings against Jesus violated nearly every one of these procedural protections. The Sanhedrin met in the middle of the night at the high priest's personal residence rather than in the official meeting hall. Witnesses were brought in, but their testimonies contradicted each other. When the case was going nowhere, the high priest took an extraordinary step. He put Jesus under oath and asked him directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." That was a reference to the book of Daniel, chapter 7, where the Son of Man is presented before the Ancient of Days and given dominion over all nations. It was a claim to cosmic authority. The high priest tore his robes and declared the statement blasphemy. Under Jewish law, blasphemy was punishable by death. There was just one problem. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish council did not have the authority to carry out executions. Only the Roman governor could authorize capital punishment, which brought Jesus before Pontius Pilate at dawn. Pilate is one of the most fascinating characters in this story because every source we have, Roman, Jewish, and Christian, agrees on the same detail. He didn't want to do it. The Gospel accounts show Pilate trying multiple escape routes. He sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, hoping Herod would handle the problem. Herod questioned Jesus, mocked him, dressed him in a fine robe, and sent him back. He was entertained but not willing to take responsibility. Pilate then tried the Passover amnesty tradition, offering to release one prisoner as a goodwill gesture. He put 2 names before the crowd, Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher accused of blasphemy, and Barabbas, a convicted insurrectionist and murderer. Pilate clearly expected the crowd to choose Jesus. They chose Barabbas. Pilate made a public show of washing his hands. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he told the crowd. That gesture wasn't just theatrical. In both Roman and Jewish culture, hand-washing was a ritual declaration of innocence. Pilate was creating a legal record that the responsibility for this execution rested on the local authorities, not on the governor's office. But when the chief priests reframed the accusation in political terms, telling Pilate that Jesus had called himself King of the Jews, and that anyone who let such a claim stand was no friend of Caesar, Pilate's resistance collapsed. A complaint to the Emperor Tiberius, who was paranoid and brutal even by Roman standards, could end his career or his life. Political survival 1. He sentenced Jesus to crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was engineered for one purpose, and it wasn't a quick death. It was a spectacle of pain designed to terrify anyone who might consider rebellion. The condemned were typically scourged first. Roman scourging used a flagrum, a multi-tailed whip embedded with bits of bone and metal, designed to tear the skin and expose muscle, and sometimes the underlying organs. Medical analyses published in the Journal of the American Medical Association have described the effects of Roman scourging in clinical detail. The blood loss alone was often fatal. Jesus survived it. He was then forced to carry the horizontal beam of his cross, called the patibulum, through the streets of Jerusalem. The beam weighed roughly 75 to 100 pounds. Weakened from the scourging, Jesus couldn't carry it the entire distance. The Gospels record that the soldiers conscripted a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, a visitor from North Africa, and forced him to carry the beam the rest of the way. The procession went out through the city gate to a rocky outcrop just outside the walls. The place was called Golgotha in Aramaic, Calvary in Latin. Both words mean the same thing, the place of the skull. Some scholars believe it was named for the skull-shaped rock formation. Others suggest it was simply a well-known execution site where remains were visible. The Romans drove iron nails through his wrists and feet. Archaeological evidence confirms this method. In 1968, construction workers in Jerusalem unearthed an ossuary, a bone box, containing the remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan. An iron nail was still embedded through his right heel bone. The nail had bent against a knot in the olive wood of the cross, making it impossible to remove during burial. Once nailed to the crossbeam, the beam was lifted and attached to the vertical post that was already fixed in the ground, and then the soldiers waited. That was the true cruelty of crucifixion, the waiting. Death came slowly, usually over 2 to 3 days, from a combination of hypovolemic shock, exhaustion, and eventually asphyxiation. The mechanics were brutal. The victim's body weight pulled the arms and shoulders out of joint, creating enormous strain on the chest cavity. Each breath required pushing upward against the nail through the feet to relieve pressure on the lungs. Over time, the muscles gave out. Breathing became impossible. The victim suffocated. Cicero, the Roman orator, called crucifixion the most cruel and disgusting penalty. Josephus called it the most wretched of deaths. It was reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. Roman citizens were exempt from it. The very idea of a crucified God would have been absurd to the average Roman. Jesus was nailed to the cross at the 3rd hour. In Jewish timekeeping, the day began at sunrise, approximately 6 a.m. The 3rd hour was roughly 9 in the morning. For the first 3 hours, from 9 until noon, the scene played out the way Roman executions typically did. Soldiers gambled for his clothing, which was their right under Roman law. Religious leaders mocked him, calling out, "He saved others, let him save himself." 2 criminals hung on crosses beside him. Passers-by hurled insults. Even one of the men dying next to him taunted him, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." Luke records that the other criminal rebuked the first one. "Don't you fear God?" he said. "We're getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, hanging beside him, bleeding, struggling to breathe, said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That exchange happened in the last hours of sunlight, because at the 6th hour, noon, everything changed. Mark's Gospel puts it plainly. When the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. Matthew records it. Luke records it. The 3 synoptic Gospels are unanimous on this point. At noon on a Friday in spring, in broad daylight, in the middle of the most populated city in the region, during the most attended festival of the year, the sun went dark. 3 hours, not a momentary blackout, not a passing shadow, not a cloud bank rolling through. 3 full hours of darkness in the middle of the day. Take a moment and imagine what that would have felt like in 1st century Jerusalem. You're standing on a hillside watching an execution. The sun is blazing, it's Passover. The city behind you is packed with hundreds of thousands of people. Smoke is rising from the temple where the afternoon sacrifices are underway, and then the light just disappears. There were no streetlights, no flashlights, no electric grids to switch on. When the sun stopped shining in the ancient world, it meant total darkness. You could barely see the person standing next to you. The temperature would have dropped rapidly. Desert climates lose heat fast without direct sunlight. The sounds of the city, the chanting, the commerce, the crowds, all of it would have shifted. People stop moving when they can't see. Confusion sets in. fear follows. And in Jewish theology, darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it was loaded with meaning. Darkness was the language God used to communicate judgment. The Egyptians experienced 3 days of impenetrable darkness as one of the 10 plagues. The prophets warned that the day of the Lord would be a day of darkness and gloom. When God showed up in judgment, the lights went out. So imagine being a faithful Jewish pilgrim in Jerusalem that afternoon. You know your scriptures. You've memorized the passages about darkness and divine wrath since childhood. You've heard the rabbis teach about the plague of darkness in Egypt and the day of the Lord described by the prophets. And now you're standing in it, at noon, while a man who claimed to be the Messiah hangs on a cross in front of you. This wasn't just a weather event. For the people who lived through it, this was a message, and the message was unmistakable. The darkness held for 3 hours, from noon until 3 p.m., the 9th hour. That's when Jesus cried out. Matthew and Mark both record the words in the original Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? Some of the bystanders misheard him. They thought he was calling for Elijah, the prophet. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him, someone said. But the words weren't a cry for Elijah. They were a direct quotation from Psalm 22, a psalm written by David roughly 1,000 years earlier. And if you sit down and read the full text of Psalm 22 from beginning to end, what you find is a description that reads like an eyewitness account of crucifixion, written a millennium before the Romans invented it. Pierced hands and feet, bones out of joint, surrounded by enemies who mock and stare, tongue stuck to the roof of the mouth from dehydration, garments divided among onlookers who cast lots for his clothing. Every one of those details was literally being fulfilled in real time, as Jesus quoted the opening line of that psalm from the cross. He wasn't just expressing anguish, he was directing his listeners to a text. In Jewish tradition, quoting the first line of a psalm was a way of referencing the entire psalm. He was saying, in effect, go read this. This is what's happening right now. Shortly after, Jesus said, it is finished. And then, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he died. At that exact moment, Matthew records, several things happened simultaneously. The earth shook. The rocks around Jerusalem split apart, tombs opened, and the massive curtain hanging inside the temple, the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, tore in two from top to bottom. We're going to come back to that veil, because the direction of that tear matters more than almost anyone realizes. But first, we need to tackle the obvious question, the one skeptics and scholars and scientists have been asking for nearly 2,000 years. What actually caused the darkness? The most common naturalistic explanation is a solar eclipse. It's the first thing modern skeptics reach for, and it sounds reasonable on the surface. The sun went dark. Eclipse. Simple. There's just one enormous problem with that theory. Passover falls on the 15th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, and the Jewish calendar is lunar. The 15th of any Jewish month is always, without exception, a full moon. Solar eclipses require a new moon. The moon has to be positioned directly between the Earth and the Sun, blocking its light. During a full moon, the moon is on the opposite side of the Earth from the Sun. It is astronomically impossible to have a solar eclipse during a full moon. That's not a matter of interpretation. It's not a theological argument. It's orbital mechanics. It's the same physics that lets NASA predict eclipses decades in advance. And ancient astronomers knew this. The Babylonians had been tracking lunar cycles for over 1,000 years before Christ. Greek astronomers had mapped the movements of celestial bodies with impressive precision. Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BC, had calculated the length of a lunar month to within 1 second of the modern value. The ancient world understood how eclipses worked, which makes the next piece of evidence even more significant. Around 52 AD, roughly 20 years after the crucifixion, a Samaritan historian named Thallus wrote a history of the Mediterranean world. His original work has been lost. That's not unusual for ancient texts. The vast majority of first-century writing hasn't survived, but fragments of Thallus survive because later writers quoted him. And one of those fragments specifically addressed the darkness at the Crucifixion. Thallus tried to explain it as a solar eclipse. Now, we know about this because a 3rd-century Christian historian named Julius Africanus read Thallus and called the eclipse explanation, in his words, unreasonable. Africanus pointed out exactly what we just discussed. An eclipse during Passover is impossible because the festival always falls on a full moon. He also noted that even the longest solar eclipses last only a few minutes. 7 minutes and 31 seconds is the theoretical maximum for a total solar eclipse at any given location, not 3 hours. So here we have a non-Christian historian writing less than 20 years after the event, not denying the darkness. He accepted it as historical. He was trying to explain it naturally. That's crucial. If the darkness were a Christian invention, if it were a legend that grew up over decades, why would a pagan historian writing just 20 years later feel the need to account for it? You don't explain away events that didn't happen. Thallus wasn't alone. Phlegon of Tralles was a Greek historian who served the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century. He compiled a massive chronological history called the Olympiades, covering events from the first Olympic Games to his own time. And in it, he recorded a remarkable darkness and an earthquake that occurred during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, which places it directly within the time frame of the Crucifixion. Phlegon was specific. He placed the event during the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, which corresponds to either 32 or 33 AD. He described the darkness as so complete that stars were visible at midday. Multiple early Christian writers cited Phlegon's account. Origen, one of the most important early church theologians, writing around 248 AD, quoted Phlegon and noted that Phlegon had confirmed both the darkness and the earthquake. Eusebius, the first great church historian, also cited him. Some modern scholars question the exact dating and whether Phlegon was describing the same event. The original text hasn't survived in its complete form, and we're relying on quotations and references from later writers. Fair enough. That's a legitimate methodological concern. But the cumulative picture is hard to dismiss. We have multiple independent sources, Christian and non-Christian, all agreeing that an unusual darkening of the sky occurred in the early 1st century, during the reign of Tiberius, in the region of Judea. The debate isn't whether something happened. The debate is what caused it. And then there's Tertullian. Tertullian was a Christian writer working in Carthage in the late 2nd and early 3rd century. He was a former lawyer, brilliant and combative, and he wrote one of the most important early defenses of the Christian faith, the Apologeticum, around 197 AD. In that text, Tertullian directly addressed Roman officials. He told them that the darkness at the moment of Christ's death was a cosmic event, a world portent, that they could verify in their own government records. He literally told them to go look it up in the imperial archives. Think about what that means. Tertullian was writing to educated Roman administrators who had access to official state records. If there were nothing in those archives, if the darkness were a fabrication, Tertullian would have been handing his opponents the easiest counter-argument in the history of debate. We checked, nothing there. He would have destroyed his own credibility and the credibility of the Christian movement in one sentence. The fact that he made this appeal publicly, in a legal defense, suggests he was confident the records would support, not contradict, his claim. Now the Roman archives are long gone. We can't verify Tertullian's challenge. The records were destroyed along with countless other ancient documents over the centuries. But the audacity of the claim tells us something about the level of confidence early Christians had in the historical reality of this event. So that's the written evidence from the ancient world. What about modern science? In 2012, a research team led by geologist Jefferson Williams published findings in the International Geology Review examining sediment cores from the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea sits along the Dead Sea Transform Fault, one of the most seismically active zones in the entire region. By analyzing layers of disturbed sediment in cores drilled from the lakebed, the researchers found evidence of a significant seismic event that they dated to a window between 26 and 36 AD. That window includes the two most widely accepted dates for the crucifixion, April 3rd, 33 AD, and April 7th, 30 AD. The dating depends on which reconstruction of the ancient Jewish calendar you follow and how you interpret certain details in the Gospel accounts. Scholars are genuinely split, but both dates fall within the seismic window. Matthew 27 specifically mentions an earthquake at the moment of Jesus' death. The earth shook and the rocks split. For a long time, skeptics treated that as poetic embellishment, dramatic storytelling, a narrative device designed to make the crucifixion seem more cosmic. The Dead Sea sediment data suggests otherwise. A real earthquake, strong enough to leave a signature in lake sediment 100 miles away, occurred in the Jerusalem area during exactly the period Matthew describes. The study was published by the Geological Society of America, and its conclusion was measured but clear. The seismic evidence is consistent with the earthquake described in the Gospel of Matthew. Does geological evidence of an earthquake prove the 3 hours of darkness? No. Earthquakes don't cause blackouts, but it adds a layer of physical corroboration to an account that many scholars had been comfortable dismissing as purely symbolic. If the earthquake was real, the bar for dismissing the darkness as invented gets higher. Some researchers have proposed other natural mechanisms. Volcanic ash from a distant eruption could theoretically darken the sky over a wide area. In 44 BC, the eruption of Mount Etna darkened skies across the Mediterranean. Massive dust storms, called Khamsin winds, occasionally sweep through the Judean desert and can reduce visibility dramatically. But none of these fit the specific details the texts insist on. The darkness lasted exactly 3 hours. It began precisely at noon, and it ended at the exact moment of death. That kind of precision doesn't match any known meteorological or volcanic pattern. Weather doesn't work on a schedule. Volcanic ash doesn't clear on cue. Dust storms don't begin and end at the top and bottom of the hour. If you're looking at this from a purely historical standpoint, here's where you end up. Multiple ancient sources, Christian and secular, confirm the darkness happened. The most popular natural explanation, a solar eclipse, is astronomically impossible on the date in question. Geological evidence supports the earthquake reported alongside the darkness. And no alternative natural mechanism accounts for the specific duration, timing, and precision of the event. The evidence doesn't force you to a supernatural conclusion. Nobody's holding your hand. But it does make every natural explanation fall apart, one by one, until you're left standing in a gap that science hasn't been able to fill. If you're finding this helpful, hit subscribe. We cover Bible mysteries and faith history like this every single week. Now, the question shifts. If the darkness wasn't an eclipse, and it wasn't a storm, and it wasn't volcanic ash, and it doesn't fit any natural pattern we can identify, then what was it for? Why darkness? Why 3 hours? Why at noon? To answer those questions, you have to go backwards, way backwards, about 1,500 years before the cross. There is a moment in the book of Exodus that most people read past without understanding what it means. After 9 plagues had devastated Egypt, after the Nile turned to blood and frogs invaded the land and gnats and flies swarmed and livestock died and boils erupted on skin and hail shattered crops and locusts consumed what was left, God sent a 9th plague, darkness. Exodus chapter 10 describes it this way. The Lord told Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky, and a darkness so thick it could be felt covered all of Egypt for 3 days. The Egyptians could not see one another. Nobody moved from their place for 3 days, but in the homes of the Israelites, in the region of Goshen, there was light. 3 days of total darkness, not an eclipse, not a storm. A darkness so dense the text says it could be physically felt. The Hebrew phrasing there is extraordinary. Choshek, the standard word for darkness, is intensified by a word that implies tangible weight and substance. This was not simply the absence of light. This was the presence of something. And then came the 10th plague, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. The 9th plague was the setup. Darkness preceded death. And the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, was the event that Passover itself was created to memorialize. Every year for 15 centuries, the Jewish people gathered to remember the night when death visited Egypt and passed over the homes of Israel because of the blood of the Lamb on their doorposts. Now hold that image and jump forward roughly 700 years to the prophet Amos. Amos was a shepherd from a small town called Tekoa, about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. He wasn't trained as a prophet. He wasn't part of the religious establishment. God pulled him out of the fields and told him to go preach. And the message Amos delivered to Israel was scorching. In Amos chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, he wrote this, "In that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into weeping." Read those words slowly. The sun going down at noon. The earth darkened in broad daylight. Feasts turned to mourning. Songs turned to weeping. Amos was describing a future day of divine judgment, and the specific details he laid out, darkness at midday during a feast, line up with the crucifixion accounts with almost uncomfortable precision. Jesus died at Passover during the feast. The darkness began at noon. The mourning that followed was total. Amos wrote those words around 750 BC, 7 centuries before the cross. The prophet Joel delivered a similar message. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Joel was describing cosmic signs that would mark the arrival of God's decisive action in human history. The Apostle Peter, just 50 days after the crucifixion, stood up in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost and quoted Joel directly. He told the crowd, many of whom had been in Jerusalem during the crucifixion and had witnessed the darkness themselves, that what Joel described had begun to be fulfilled. Peter wasn't making a vague spiritual point. He was telling people who had stood in the darkness at noon, who had felt the earthquake, who had heard about the torn veil, that everything they experienced that Friday was what the prophets had been pointing toward. The prophet Zephaniah reinforced the same theme. The great day of the Lord is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Isaiah described a servant of God who would be stricken, smitten, and afflicted on behalf of others. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. The pattern across the Hebrew prophets is relentless. When God acts in decisive judgment, darkness is the signal, not a random omen, not a coincidence, a deliberate, unmistakable sign. So when darkness fell over Jerusalem at noon on the day of the crucifixion, every Jewish person in that city who knew their scriptures would have felt the weight of what was happening. This was the language of divine action. God was doing something, and whatever it was catastrophic. Now here's where the theology gets deep. Because in Jewish sacrificial practice, there's a specific annual event that connects directly to those 3 hours on the cross, and most people outside of seminary have never heard it explained this way. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest of Israel, performed the most sacred ritual in the entire Jewish religion. He entered the most holy place in the temple, the inner sanctum, the room where the Ark of the Covenant had originally been placed, the room where God's presence was believed to dwell. The rest of the year, nobody entered this room. Nobody. It was sealed off by a massive curtain called the veil. According to Jewish historical sources, including the Mishnah and Talmud, this veil was about 60 feet tall, 30 feet wide, and roughly 4 inches thick. It was woven so heavily that, according to one tradition, it took 300 priests to handle it during washing. On Yom Kippur, the high priest passed through that curtain. He carried the blood of a sacrificial goat and a bull. He sprinkled the blood on the mercy seat, the gold lid of the ark. And in doing so, he symbolically atoned for the sins of the entire nation for another year. But the encounter was considered so dangerous, so charged with divine presence, that the rabbis taught that a rope was tied around the high priest's ankle before he entered. if he died inside the most holy place, because he was unclean or had performed the ritual incorrectly, they could pull his body out without anyone else having to go in. Here is the detail that connects everything. When the high priest went behind the veil, he disappeared from view. The nation waited outside. They couldn't see what was happening. The atonement was made in the dark, in the hidden place, behind the curtain. The presence of God behind that veil was explicitly associated with darkness. 1 Kings chapter 8 records Solomon's words at the dedication of the first temple. The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. When God's glory filled the temple, a cloud so dense that the priests couldn't stand to minister filled the space. The God of Israel was a God who did his deepest work in the dark. So when the sky went black over Golgotha, the theological message was layered. This was the Day of Atonement happening in real time, out in the open, not in a temple, but on a hill outside the city walls, not with the blood of a goat, but with the blood of a man who claimed to be God's own son, not behind a curtain, but visible to the entire city, except for the fact that God drew a curtain of darkness across the sky. The 3 hours of darkness were the cosmic version of the high priest disappearing behind the veil. The world went dark because something was happening between God and the sacrifice that no human eye was meant to witness. The atonement of the world wasn't a public performance. It was a private transaction of infinite weight. And when it was finished, when Jesus cried out, "It is finished," and breathed his last, the veil in the temple tore. Matthew says it ripped from top to bottom. That detail is enormously important. A curtain 60 feet tall and 4 inches thick doesn't tear from the top down by accident. If human hands had ripped it, the tear would start from the bottom at a height people could reach. A tear that starts at the top, 60 feet above the floor, and runs all the way to the bottom implies that the force came from above, from inside the most holy place, from the direction of God. The message was visceral and immediate. The barrier between God and humanity was removed. The room that only one priest could enter 1 day a year under penalty of death was suddenly open. The entire sacrificial system, the 15 centuries of lambs and goats and bulls and incense and blood and ritual, had reached its conclusion. The writer of Hebrews in the New Testament connects this explicitly. He calls Jesus the ultimate high priest, one who entered the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood. And by doing so, he obtained eternal redemption, not annual, eternal. The Day of Atonement happened once for all. The darkness lifted, the veil was torn, and the first person to understand what had just happened wasn't a priest, it wasn't a prophet, it wasn't a theologian. It was a Roman soldier standing at the foot of the cross. The centurion stationed at Golgotha had watched the entire thing. He had supervised the scourging that morning. He had driven the nails or ordered his men to do it. He had watched Jesus refuse the wine mixed with myrrh that was offered as a mild painkiller. He had stood through the mocking, the gambling, the shouting. He had seen prisoners die before, many of them. Then the darkness came, and for 3 hours, this seasoned military officer stood in it. He felt the earthquake. He heard the cry in Aramaic. He watched Jesus die, and when it was over, Mark records his response. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Consider what it took to pull that confession out of a Roman centurion. This was a professional soldier. Centurions commanded 80 men and had typically served for 15 to 20 years before reaching that rank. They were selected for their courage, their discipline, and their ability to maintain order in the most brutal circumstances imaginable. They were hardened men, pragmatic men. They had likely supervised dozens, if not hundreds, of executions. They were not easily moved by suffering. And Roman soldiers had no framework for a Jewish Messiah. The concept of a divine Jewish king wasn't just foreign to Roman thinking, it was politically threatening. Everything about this centurion's training and worldview should have led him to dismiss the dying man as another failed revolutionary getting what he deserved. But he didn't. Something about those 3 hours, the darkness, the earthquake, the way Jesus spoke, the way he died without cursing his executioners, broke through whatever walls this soldier had constructed around his understanding of the world. He looked at a dead Jewish criminal and publicly confessed that this was the Son of God, in front of his own men, in a culture where expressing sympathy for a condemned prisoner could be seen as disloyalty. Luke's account adds a layer. Luke, who was a physician by training and the most detail-oriented of the 4 gospel writers, records the centurion's reaction with a slightly different emphasis. He says the centurion praised God and declared, "Surely this was a righteous man." A Roman soldier, praising the God of the Jews. At the scene of an execution he himself carried out. After 3 hours of darkness that defied every natural explanation, the weight of that moment is hard to overstate, and the centurion wasn't alone in his response. Luke says the crowds who had gathered to watch the spectacle, and crucifixions always drew crowds, the same people who had been jeering and gawking, went home beating their breasts. That's a gesture of deep mourning and repentance in Jewish culture. People who came to watch entertainment left in grief. The darkness changed them. The earthquake changed them. Whatever they experienced in those 3 hours, it recalibrated something inside the people who witnessed it. Then there was Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph was a wealthy, respected member of the Sanhedrin, the very council that had condemned Jesus to death. But the Gospels tell us that Joseph had not consented to their decision. He had been a secret disciple of Jesus, afraid to speak up publicly because opposing the high priest's agenda carried serious consequences. After the darkness and the earthquake and the death, Joseph stopped hiding. He went directly to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who had just authorized the execution, and asked for the body. That took extraordinary courage, a member of the Jewish ruling council publicly associating himself with a man just crucified for treason against Rome. That's the kind of move that ends careers and invites investigation. Pilate could have arrested him. The Sanhedrin could have expelled him. Joseph didn't care anymore. Whatever calculation had kept him silent for months or years, the 3 hours of darkness overwhelmed it. He took the body down from the cross, wrapped it in clean linen, and placed it in his own new tomb, carved from solid rock, in a garden near Golgotha. He rolled a large stone across the entrance. The Gospel of John adds that Nicodemus joined him. Nicodemus was another Sanhedrin member, the one who had visited Jesus secretly at night earlier in his ministry, afraid to be seen. He brought 75 pounds of burial spices, myrrh and aloes. That's an extravagant quantity. According to some historical sources, that's the amount you'd use for royalty. 2 men who had been hiding stepped into the open and gave Jesus a burial fit for a king. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee watched where the body was laid: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, Salome, others. Luke says they went home and prepared their own spices and perfumes. And then they rested on the Sabbath, in obedience to the commandment. That Sabbath must have been unlike any other in the history of Jerusalem. The darkness had shaken the city. The earthquake had cracked rocks and opened tombs. And inside the temple, the priests would have discovered the damage to the veil. A curtain 60 feet tall and 4 inches thick, ripped from ceiling to floor. The most holy place exposed. For a religious system built entirely on the boundary between the sacred and the common, between God's space and human space, this was a disaster without precedent. The Talmud preserves some fascinating traditions about signs and wonders at the temple during approximately this period. There are references to the temple doors swinging open by themselves, which Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai interpreted as a sign that the temple would eventually be destroyed. The westernmost light of the menorah, which was supposed to burn continuously, reportedly went out and refused to stay lit. And the crimson thread that was traditionally tied to the scapegoat on Yom Kippur, which was supposed to turn white as a sign that God had accepted the atonement, reportedly stopped changing color. For 40 years before the temple's destruction in 70 AD, 40 years before 70 AD is 30 AD, right in the window of the crucifixion. The rabbis debated these signs for generations. They didn't attribute them to Jesus, they didn't connect them to the crucifixion, but the timing is remarkable, and the theological implication is the same. Something changed in the temple's relationship to God around the time of the cross. The old system was winding down. That Friday night, the celebration of Passover continued in homes across Jerusalem. Families gathered around tables. Lambs were eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The ancient liturgy was recited, remembering the night when death visited Egypt and the blood of the lamb saved the firstborn of Israel. But this year, the symbols had collided with something real. The Passover lamb had been slaughtered at the same time as a man on a cross who had called himself the Lamb of God. The darkness that preceded the death of the firstborn in Egypt had returned, hovering over the city for 3 hours while a firstborn son died on a hill outside the walls. The people who had witnessed it were still processing. They didn't have a framework yet for what had happened. That would come later, after the reports from the empty tomb on Sunday morning, after the appearances, after Peter stood up at Pentecost and connected all the threads. But on that Friday night, all they had was the darkness, the earthquake, the torn curtain, and the strange, unshakable feeling that the world had just tilted on its axis. Let's go back to where we started. A Friday afternoon. Jerusalem. The sky is wrong. We began this video with a mystery. 3 hours of unexplained darkness during the most public execution in the most attended festival in the ancient Jewish calendar. And we've now traced that event through every line of available evidence. The historical record shows that multiple non-Christian sources confirmed the darkness. Thallus, writing around 52 AD, acknowledged the event and tried to attribute it to a solar eclipse. Julius Africanus, in the 3rd century, pointed out that Thallus's explanation was impossible because of the full moon at Passover. Phlegon of Tralles, a Greek historian working for Emperor Hadrian, recorded a profound darkness and earthquake during the reign of Tiberius, placing it directly within the crucifixion timeframe. And Tertullian challenged Roman officials to verify the event in their own imperial archives. The scientific record shows that the eclipse theory collapses on fundamental astronomy. Passover demands a full moon. Eclipses demand a new moon. The two are mutually exclusive. Solar eclipses last minutes, not hours. And geological evidence from Dead Sea sediment cores, published by the Geological Society of America, confirms a significant earthquake in the Jerusalem region within the precise window of the crucifixion date. The prophetic record shows that this event was described centuries before it happened. Amos specifically prophesied darkness at noon during a feast. Joel described the sun turning to darkness before the day of the Lord. The 9th plague of Egypt established the pattern of darkness preceding the ultimate sacrifice. And the Day of Atonement ritual connected darkness, divine presence, sacrifice, and atonement in a framework that reached its fulfillment on the cross. The eyewitness record shows that the people who experienced those 3 hours were permanently changed. A Roman centurion confessed faith in a Jewish Messiah. A secret disciple on the ruling council went public. Crowds who had called for blood went home in mourning. And within weeks, a movement began in that same city that would eventually reach every corner of the globe. No single data point proves the case by itself. History doesn't work that way. History gives you pieces, and you decide how they fit together. But the pieces here converge. They point toward a Friday afternoon when the world went dark, when something happened between heaven and earth that the natural order cannot fully account for, and when the people closest to it walked away with the conviction that the universe had fundamentally changed. The 3 hours of darkness remain, after 2,000 years, one of the most documented and least explained events in the ancient world. Skeptics acknowledge that something happened. Believers say they know what it was. The debate continues. But here's the part that most documentaries skip, and it's the part that matters most. If the darkness was real, and the weight of evidence says it was, and if the meaning the eyewitnesses assigned to it was even partially accurate, then those 3 hours weren't only about first-century Jerusalem. They were about you, sitting here right now, wherever you are. The whole point of the torn veil is access. The thing that kept humanity at a distance from the divine was removed. The whole point of the sacrifice is exchange. Something was given so that something else could be received. The whole point of the darkness lifting is that the light was meant to return, not just to the sky over Judea, but to the lives of people who feel like they've been walking in the dark for years, wondering if anything out there is paying attention. That's the claim at the center of this story. Not just that something happened in history, but that something happened for you, specifically, personally, regardless of what century you were born in. The centurion at the foot of the cross wasn't a theologian. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet. He was a soldier doing a terrible job on a terrible day. And in the middle of the darkness, something got through to him. He saw something he couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. And nothing was the same after that. 2,000 years later, the invitation is identical. The veil is still torn. The access is still open. The offer stands. Whether you've been reading the Bible your entire life or you clicked on this video because the title caught your eye, the 3 hours of darkness are still asking the same question they asked the centurion, the same question they asked Joseph of Arimathea, the same question they asked every person who went home beating their chest that Friday evening. What just happened? And what are you going to do about it? The darkness lasted 3 hours. The light that followed has been burning for 2,000 years, and it hasn't gone out yet. If this video opened your eyes to something new, subscribe and hit the bell. We go deep on Bible mysteries, ancient history, and the stories behind the stories every week. And if this is your first time here, the video on screen right now connects directly to what we just covered. I think you'll find it just as fascinating. I'll see you in the next one.